Quality trade or profession. That was one of the columns you had to fill in those old style baptism registers, either of the parents, in the case of infant baptisms, or of the candidates themselves, if adult. Quality trade or profession. When I went to the West Indies in 1973, one of the tasks I had was to deal with applications for baptism and the baptism registers, and many of them I saw were those same old style ones that you can see still to be found in parish churches and safes, including our own, up and down this country and many parts of the world, I would guess. And so looking through the baptism registers for that particular Caribbean parish for the years between 1827 and 1833 or so, I made a terrible discovery. In the column for quality trade or profession, one word appeared without interruption on page after page. That one word was slave. I was aghast and appalled, and yet I wanted to understand. Later research told me that the British government and the Anglican Church changed the previous policy at around that time in response to the policy that was called amelioration, that is, betterment, as it was called, of the slave's condition, and in preparation for freedom for the slaves, it was deemed that they could be now and should be therefore baptized. But what a savage irony that column, quality trade or profession, had been filled in with a word that seemed to make a mockery of that heading. And how was it, I asked myself, that the rector at the time had performed these baptisms, so many, and signed the register, though belonging to a church which had not been in the forefront, at least in the Caribbean, of the move to free the slaves, and had been fiercely critical of those who were missionaries from the Baptist Missionary Society, for instance. And how was it that I had grown up without any idea that such a system of widespread mass slave labour had been carried on for at least 2 centuries right across the Caribbean in the colonies of quite a few European nations? Slavery, it seemed, had been forgotten after just 140 years. And Jesus says in today's gospel, "Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." And the end of today's gospel passage also, in its wording, comes straight out of the institution of slavery. He will give his life as a ransom for many. The idea of a ransom or a payment paid leads us into the world of slavery. Jesus is speaking of himself, the Son of Man, and he uses the word here, lutron antipolon, a ransom for many. That word for ransom here, lutron, is used in the Greek Old Testament at places where it described how the next of kin could pay to free a relative who was a slave. And in literature outside the Bible, likewise, it's used of freeing prisoners of war or slaves by means of a payment of some kind. And so, when later New Testament writers wanted to describe what Jesus accomplished, they reached for another word related to lutron, apolutrosis, or redemption, paying the price for the freedom of slaves. And of course, this is exactly what happened in 1834, when the British government simply bought freedom en masse for all the slaves in their colonies by compensating all the slave owners, buying them out, in fact, compensating them, large and small, and of course it was a colossal sum, possibly most, if not all, equivalent to most, if not all, of a year's government revenue. So, to be a Christian is to have been freed from slavery, from bondage to sin, or even the devil, to live a life of freedom. It's an act of redemption. So the New Testament writers often exhort us with words like, "You've been bought with a price. Do not throw away your freedom by lapsing back into sin." And so the New Testament does, in fact, use the same word for someone being a slave as it does for someone being a slave to sin. The institution of slavery, ancient and modern, has in fact provided the Bible and Christianity with many of the words and concepts we use to describe what is most precious to our faith. The most startling use of the vocabulary of slavery is, of course, in the words of Jesus himself. In particular, the phrase that we quoted earlier, "Whoever wants to be first among you must be slave of all." And whereas in some parts of today's gospel, the word for servant or serve are used here, in fact, when Jesus says, "You must be the slave of all," the actual word slave, not servant, slave is used. It's the Greek word doulos. It does mean slave, not servant, in both classical and biblical Greek. And slavery was an integral part of society in the time of Jesus. So it's not surprising that words which reflect slavery are everywhere in the Bible, in both Old and New Testaments. But it's interesting how mainstream translations have, at least in the past, shied away from translating doulos as slave, and words related to doulos as slavery. I wonder why. For instance, in the authorized version of the passage in question, we read this: "And whoever of you will be the chiefest shall be servant of all." By contrast, here's Rowan Williams' own translation of the last sentence of today's gospel, where, at the other extreme, he translates the word diakonos and verbs derived from it, strictly meaning servant, as slave as well. "Anyone among you who wants to be great must be your slave. If you want to be the first of all, you must be the slave of all. For this mortal person did not come to have slaves attending on him. He came to be a slave. He came to give his life as the price that bought back multitudes." And the translation, today's English version, says, "The Son of Man did not come to be a slave master, but a slave who will give his life to rescue many people." It has been pointed out that the influence of such passages as this on the abolition of slavery in the 19th century would have been greater, much greater, if the authorized version had translated doulos, correctly in my opinion, as slave. Because in fact, if you read the writings of those early abolitionists in Britain at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, it was the analogy between real slavery and slavery to sin, from which Jesus releases us by his ransoming death, that provided such a powerful inspiration to those who campaigned for the freedom of the slaves in those years. But the greatest link of all, and the most powerful, is the fact that crucifixion in the Roman world was the punishment reserved above all for slaves. Throughout human history, the most savage punishments have always been reserved for slaves. So when Jesus says the first among you must be slave of all, he surely has himself in mind. He is the slave who undergoes the punishment used for slaves, and especially those involved in slave rebellions, at the hands of the cruel and tyrannical officials of the Roman Empire, that was used above all to keep slaves in submission by its terrible cruelty. Perhaps we should see here an analogy with the many slave revolts in the Caribbean in the last years of slavery. The gut-wrenching and obscene barbarity with which the slave revolt leaders and their fellow followers were executed and punished not only reminds us of crucifixion, it also began to turn many people's minds towards abolition of slavery and freedom for the slaves. Such was the abhorrence at, yes, the violence of the rebellions themselves and their violent suppression. So, in a wonderful reversal, Christian belief sees this death of Jesus, this slave on the cross, as the ransom paid to free many other slaves, the slaves of sin, now freed by this ransoming death. Jesus shows that the way of servanthood is the way of liberation. The way of non-violence will need a costly self-sacrifice. And the Messiah that Peter said he believed in will be that spoken of in Isaiah's suffering servant that we heard in the first reading, and in the lowly slave of all. According to Jesus, that's the only Messiah on offer, a slave who frees his fellow slaves. We are now free to be slaves, not of an earthly master, but of all our fellow men and women.